The first day or so, we pointed to our countries. The third or fourth day, we were pointing to our continents. By the fifth day, we were only aware of Earth. Sultan bin Salman Al Saud, Saudi Arabian Air Force pilot and payload specialist. Many space explorers have spoken of the orbital perspective when looking at Earth, one in which national, ethnic, racial, regional, and religious identities take a step back. For another quasi-religious perspective, a universalist concept that brings all of humanity together, and perhaps all Terrans or Earthlings together. Except for the mosquitoes. Fuck them. After all, a view from Earth from space doesn't look like this, with its borders and political arrangements, but rather like this. It's a beautiful thought, a goal to strive towards. However, the asshole in me wants to point out that, while not seen by the naked eye, these borders on our beautiful blue and green marble do indeed exist. Not from the vantage point of space, but from the vantage point of geopolitics. And to a minor degree, they affect space itself. I will admit that the title of this video is a little bit of an oxymoron. The geopolitics of space. Geo means Earth from Greek. Yet I'm talking about what happens off the Earth's surface. Granted, the decisions made on Earth will affect a tiny sliver of space. And after all, space is not separate from the Earth, but rather Earth is a tiny component of space. Throughout human history, humans looked at the skies and saw their ancestors or gods. Some thought the stars were not balls of gas, but rather holes of light poked out from the heavens. Even the words we use to describe space have religious undertones, celestial bodies in the heavens. Cosmology tends to inspire science and mythology alike. We have even named the planets of our solar system after Roman gods. Neptune, the god of the oceans, Venus, the god of love, Mars, the god of war. Speaking of war, let's go back down to Earth. While I hope space exploration will be the confines of science and our shared humanity, I must, pun partially intended, ground it, and recognize that space exploration started through the lens of geopolitics, and will continue to be the purview of geopolitics. Much of the technology we use to produce these incredible feats of science, technology, and engineering were the product, not of curiosity, but oftentimes of death and destruction. The rocket technology that drove the first man to the moon was created by the Germans, led by von Braun, who invented the V-2 rocket. The Americans would eventually take up von Braun, and instead of punishing him for helping the German war machine, would use him to produce the rockets that would bring Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon. The story of space exploration lies in the aftermath of one of the most titanic ideological battles in humanity, one in which science, technology, and manpower were put to the test. The modern religions of capitalist, liberal democracy, on one hand, and communism on the other hand, teamed up together to defeat fascism, and then adopt much of fascism's technology, as an alliance of convenience crumbled into the long Cold War that enveloped nearly every part of the world, and yes, even space. One between liberal democracy and capitalism on one hand and totalitarian communism on the other hand. There are many theaters of the war: the dividing walls of Berlin, the battlefields of Vietnam and Afghanistan, and the outermost atmosphere of our shared homeworld. The space race was born. In 1957, the Soviet Union, oftentimes dismissed by Western Europeans as a backwater, launched the first artificial satellite into space, stunning Western democratic nations who saw themselves as being the forefront of science and technology, especially the Americans. The Soviet Union would follow with a winning streak, putting Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, eventually followed by the first woman, and even dog in space. In response to this, many Americans and other Westerners were shocked, seeing their own system, civilization, and way of life as being inferior. But President Kennedy didn't give up. He raised the bar. In 1961, he promised to put a man on the moon. After all, his predecessor, President Eisenhower had invested a great deal of money and mind power into infrastructure and scientific research projects, setting up NASA. After trial and error and further humiliation by the Soviets, the Americans came through, developing heavy lift vehicles launched off the surface of the Earth, most famously von Braun's Saturn V rocket, which eventually sent Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon. The Americans were falling behind at the beginning, but like an Olympic sprinter at the last few seconds, managed to beat their opponent, and landed 5 more crews throughout the 70s. Generally speaking, the Americans won in the long run, with the greatest accomplishment of going to the moon. However, no one can deny the profound accomplishments of the Soviets. Despite the geopolitical tensions, Americans and Russians to this day share a certain degree of camaraderie as the first 2 spacefaring nations. This led to the Apollo-Soyuz test project called the Handshake in Space, as the Cold War during the 70s thawed, yet only for a brief period of time. This eventually led to the Shuttle Mir program, during which American space shuttles would transport astronauts and cosmonauts to the Russian Soyuz spacecraft during the early to mid-90s. This was a period of time in which the relationship between the Western nations and Russia, previously the Soviet Union, was at an all-time high. This would eventually lead to the International Space Station, which include not only the US and Russia, but also the European Union, the UK, Japan, Canada, as well as some other nations on some minor level. A sort of unity among the most advanced nations of the developed world. When the space shuttle program ended, astronauts would have to go to Kazakhstan, which is basically a Russian space station, to end up going to the International Space Station. To this day, various other countries have managed to launch orbital objects into space, such as India, Japan, South Korea, Israel, Iran, as well as the EU. China has also been successful with crewed spacecraft. There have also been some proliferation of private companies interested in tourism and potential resource extraction. At this point, the industry is in a state of nascency. However, as technology improves and given the resources available for mining and other materials, I can see market forces creating a snowball effect that will eventually lead to investment in the private sector in space on a massive level. All of this makes me sound cynical, but at the end of the day, it's worth noting that much of our obsession with space travel had to do with geopolitics in the first place, namely the Cold War, less so about inspiring the hearts and minds of future generations. All of which leads me to my next subject, space law. Ever since aircraft have been used, or even for that matter multi-story buildings have been built, the subject of airspace sovereignty has been debated. However, space travel and space law throughout much of the 20th century was the purview of 2 nations, the US and the USSR. Nonetheless, in 1967, the Outer Space Treaty was signed, with over 100 nations signing it into law to this day. However, far less of them are actually spacefaring nations. The primary purpose of this treaty was to quell fears of war around Earth's orbit. This involved the potential of using satellites as methods of attacking Earthbound targets, or satellites destroying other satellites, or Earth targets targeting satellites. Keep in mind that while rockets were being used to push satellites into space, rockets were also being used for intercontinental ballistic missiles during the height of the Cold War. Previously, before the Space Treaty in 1963, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed to ban the testing of nukes in outer space. The Space Treaty banned nukes from space and declared all heavenly bodies to be used for civilian purposes, namely science. While weapons were being tested in the desert, tundra, and distant tropical islands, space was cut off limits. It is a little bit weird that military forces are restricted from a place where nobody lives, at least not permanently. If this sounds familiar, much of this was inspired by the Antarctica Treaty, which also blocked off military use in the frozen wasteland, keeping it reserved for civilian purposes, while allowing military use where the vast majority of people lived in. I understand why it exists, but I just can't help but think that it's a little bit funny. The Outer Space Treaty did keep the door open for economic activity, such as the moon or asteroid mining. However, we have yet to have the technology to make this economically viable. When that does happen, I could see more geopolitical controversies multiplying over who controls what asteroid or section of the moon. And when resources are involved, the arms needed to protect those resources will come into play, treaty or not. Some companies have pushed the US Congress to pass the Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act of 2015, which, if passed, would allow for mining and other resource extraction in space. However, it would not allow for the exploitation of extraterrestrial life. So I suppose if there was bacteria found on an asteroid, it would not be available for extraction. I guess you would also not be allowed to farm alien space cows either. In 1979, a few countries signed the Moon Treaty, which stated that whatever happens on the moon must be confined within the UN Charter. However, it was not signed by any of the major spacefaring nations, which seems to suggest that lunar politics may resemble geopolitics before the UN and a lot of its baggage came into play. Which is concerning, but that's far away in the distant future. Other treaties were signed in regards to the rescue of astronauts, as well as the liability of damages caused by satellites and aircraft. Unsurprisingly, the major spacefaring nations have not been particularly strict when it comes to following the Outer Space Treaty. Russia has sent up its own military space wing during the 90s, until it was disbanded, only to re-emerge during the 2000s. And then disband again, and then re-emerge in 2015, being merged with the Russian Air Force, now called the Russian Aerospace Forces. So Russia doesn't have its own separate Space Force, however the Space Force is basically a subcomponent of this Air Force. In the United States, the Trump administration set up the Space Force as a separate force within the military, not part of the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, or even the Air Force. The Space Force only has a few thousand in numbers, but does control numerous spacecraft, namely satellites, for military communications. As lame as it sounds, this is less of a force and more of an organization to essentially aid military communication through the use of satellites. The Chinese have also set up their integrated space systems into a larger People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, which covers space, electronic, and cyber warfare. I would not be surprised if various European nations, Japan, and India eventually develop their own space forces. So while I would like to see a day where we all live in a Star Trek universe where humanity unites to explore the galaxy in peace and harmony with no fear other than that of the Borg or the Klingon, it's time to bring this conversation back to Earth. Thanks for watching.